Why does forgiving someone who pushed you away feel harder than forgiving someone who stayed and fought? The person who disappeared, who went silent, who withdrew just when you needed them most. Their absence creates a wound that doesn't follow the normal rules of healing. When someone hurts you through their presence, through harsh words or visible actions, you can point to the moment and say, "That's when it happened." But when an avoidant hurts you, the damage comes through what didn't happen, through the conversations that never occurred, through the reassurance that never came, through the presence that evaporated. You're left trying to forgive a ghost, trying to make peace with someone who wasn't there, and that particular kind of hurt settles into your bones differently than any other betrayal. The confusion deepens because avoidants often seem genuinely confused about what they did wrong. They didn't cheat, didn't lie, didn't explode, they just needed space. From their perspective, they were managing their own overwhelm the only way they knew how, and now you're treating their self-preservation like it was a deliberate attack. This disconnect between your experience of abandonment and their experience of necessary withdrawal creates a gap that makes forgiveness feel impossible. You're angry at someone who doesn't even understand why you're hurt, and they're bewildered by the intensity of your pain over what felt to them like a reasonable need for distance. In this video, you'll learn the specific protocol for forgiving an avoidant who hurt you, not the generic forgiveness advice that tells you to let it go or understand their perspective, but the actual psychological process that addresses the unique nature of avoidant wounds. You'll discover why traditional forgiveness methods fail with avoidant hurt, the specific reframes that make forgiveness possible without abandoning your own reality, and the exact internal shifts that allow you to release the pain without needing the avoidant to ever understand what they did. This isn't about excusing their behavior or pretending the hurt wasn't real. It's about freeing yourself from carrying their inability to show up as a weight in your own chest. You're sitting alone, months after the relationship ended or shifted, and you realize you're still rehearsing conversations that will never happen. You're still constructing the perfect explanation of how their withdrawal affected you, still imagining their face finally understanding, still waiting for a recognition that isn't coming. The cost becomes clear. Not what they took from you during the relationship, but what you're giving them now, long after they've moved on. You're trapped in a loop of trying to make them see something they may never be capable of seeing, and that loop is eating up your present while they're already gone. Forgiving an avoidant requires understanding what actually happened beneath the surface of their withdrawal. When avoidants deactivate, when they pull away and shut down, they're not making a calculated decision to hurt you, they're experiencing a neurobiological flooding that makes connection feel like drowning. Their nervous system perceives emotional intimacy as a threat, triggering the same fight-or-flight response that would activate if they were facing physical danger. In that state, their brain literally cannot access the parts that process empathy, that consider your experience, that maintain relational awareness. They're not choosing distance over you. They're surviving the only way their system knows how. This isn't an excuse for the impact of their behavior, but understanding the mechanism helps explain why they seem to transform into a different person, why the warm, present partner disappeared and left a cold stranger in their place. The hurt you experienced was absolutely real, even if their intention wasn't to cause it. Most forgiveness advice fails with avoidant wounds because it tries to make you choose between validating your pain and understanding their behavior, as if those two truths can't coexist. Traditional forgiveness models say, "They didn't mean to hurt you, so let it go," or "Understand their trauma, so forgive their actions." But with avoidant hurt, you need a both-and approach. Their deactivation was driven by overwhelming internal flooding that hijacked their capacity for relational presence, and the impact on you was genuinely damaging and worthy of grief. They were doing the best they could with a nervous system in survival mode, and you deserved so much better than what their best could offer in that moment. Both statements are true. Holding both simultaneously is the foundation of genuine forgiveness. The forgiveness protocol starts with validating your own experience without needing their acknowledgement. Write down every specific moment of hurt, not the general, They withdrew from me. But the concrete instances, the night you cried and they went silent, the conversation where you expressed a need and they changed the subject, the moment you reached for connection and met a wall, the time you tried to repair and they disappeared for days. Document the actual impact on your nervous system, your sleep, your sense of safety, your ability to trust your own perceptions. This isn't about building a case against them. It's about honoring that your pain was real and deserved recognition, even if they couldn't provide it. Most people skip this step, rushing toward understanding and compassion for the avoidant before they've fully acknowledged the legitimate damage. That creates false forgiveness, the kind that looks peaceful on the surface but leaves resentment buried underneath, waiting to resurface. After you've fully documented your experience, the next shift involves separating their character from their capacity in that moment. This distinction is crucial because most people believe forgiving means deciding the person is actually good despite the bad thing they did, or that the bad thing wasn't actually that bad. Neither of those mental gymnastics is necessary. Instead, you acknowledge that their behavior during deactivation represented the absolute limit of their capacity when their nervous system was flooded, not a revelation of their true character or feelings toward you. Think of it like someone with a broken leg who can't run to help you in an emergency. Their inability to run doesn't mean they don't care about you, but their inability is still real, and the consequences of their immobility still affect you. The avoidant's capacity for presence, empathy, and emotional availability literally broke down under the weight of their own flooding. That breakdown was real, the consequences were real, and it also wasn't a referendum on your worth or their regard for you. Many people get stuck here because they interpret the avoidant's withdrawal as evidence that they didn't matter enough, that if the avoidant really cared, they would have fought through their discomfort. This belief makes forgiveness impossible because it frames the hurt as a deliberate devaluation rather than a capacity collapse. Understanding that their deactivation was about their maximum threshold, not your value, allows you to grieve what they couldn't provide without making it mean something about your worthiness of love. You can acknowledge, they couldn't show up for me in the way I needed, without the subtext of, because I wasn't worth showing up for. Those are completely different statements with completely different implications for your healing. The most challenging part of forgiving an avoidant involves releasing them from the debt you feel they owe you. Every time they withdrew, every time they went silent, every time they prioritized their comfort over your legitimate needs, a transaction occurred in your internal ledger. They took something, your sense of security, your trust, your emotional energy, your time, and now some part of you believes they owe you repayment. That debt might look like an apology, an explanation, acknowledgement of the hurt, changed behavior, or simply finally understanding what they did. As long as you're holding that debt, waiting for repayment, you're psychologically tethered to them. You're giving them power over your peace because your healing is contingent on them delivering something they may never be capable of providing. Releasing the debt doesn't mean what they did was okay, or that you're absolving them of responsibility. It means accepting that you will never receive from them what you legitimately deserved, and you're choosing to stop letting that unpaid debt drain your life force. This feels like giving up, like letting them off the hook, like saying the hurt didn't matter. But it's actually the opposite. It's acknowledging the hurt mattered so much that you refuse to compound it by staying stuck in a psychological prison, waiting for them to hand you the key. You're giving yourself permission to grieve the absence of what you should have received, to feel the anger and sadness of that loss, and then to close the account. Not because they paid what they owed, but because you're no longer willing to be the bank that stays open waiting for a payment that isn't coming. Practically, this looks like a written exercise where you itemize everything you feel the avoidant owes you. The apology they never gave, the explanation they never offered, the changed behavior they never demonstrated, the understanding they never reached, the reassurance they never provided. Write every single item in your ledger. Then, for each item, write this exact phrase. I release you from the debt of specific item. I deserved this. I didn't receive it, and I'm no longer waiting for you to provide it. I grieve its absence, and I close this account. The act of consciously closing each debt, one by one, creates a psychological shift that passive forgiveness attempts never achieve. You're not pretending the debt didn't exist. You're actively choosing to stop collecting. After releasing the debt, the next layer involves reframing the relationship from "this person hurt me" to "this person showed me their limits, and I chose to stay beyond the point where those limits were sustainable for me." This reframe is delicate because it can easily slide into self-blame, into "it's my fault for staying," which simply redirects the unforgiveness inward. That's not the goal. Instead, you're acknowledging that at some point in the dynamic, you received information about their capacity, maybe through their withdrawal patterns, their inability to communicate during conflict, their disappearing acts, and you made a choice to continue investing in the connection, hoping their capacity would change. That wasn't naive or wrong. It was human and hopeful. But it also means the continued hurt that came after you had that information is partly about the gap between their actual capacity and your hope for their potential capacity. This reframe shifts some of the power back to you because it acknowledges you weren't just a passive victim of their behavior. You were an active participant in a dynamic where you chose to keep engaging despite mounting evidence that their nervous system couldn't sustain the level of intimacy you needed. Recognizing your own agency in staying doesn't excuse their hurtful behavior, but it does reduce the sense of helplessness that makes forgiveness so difficult. When you see yourself as someone who made understandable choices, given the information and hopes you had at the time, rather than someone who was simply done to by a cruel person, forgiveness becomes less about absolving them and more about making peace with the whole situation, including your part in it. The protocol also requires grieving the fantasy of who you thought they were or could become. Every avoidant who hurts you deeply does so partly because you believed in a version of them that their nervous system couldn't consistently access. You saw them in their activated moments when their defenses were down and they were warm and present and connected. You fell in love with that person. You committed to that person. You built your hopes around that person. But that person was their optimal state, not their baseline, and certainly not their capacity under stress. When they deactivated, you kept expecting the warm version to return, kept trying to reach that person, kept feeling betrayed by the cold stranger who replaced them. Forgiving means grieving that the warm version wasn't the whole truth. It was a part of them, absolutely real in those moments, but not sustainable when their system felt threatened by too much closeness. This grief is profound because it means accepting you were in love with someone who could only show up partially, someone whose most authentic self included both the warmth and the withdrawal. You can't forgive the avoidant until you've mourned the loss of the person you thought you were forgiving. You have to let die the fantasy that they were just scared or confused or going through something temporary, and accept that their pattern of deactivation is deeply rooted in their attachment wiring. That person you're trying to forgive, the one who would finally understand, who would apologize meaningfully, who would change their patterns, that person doesn't exist. You're forgiving the actual person whose capacity is genuinely limited by their nervous system's threat response to intimacy, and that means first grieving the imagined person who haunts your hopes. Another critical element involves understanding that their inability to repair is part of the same system that caused the original hurt. Many people become re-traumatized not just by the avoidance withdrawal, but by their complete inability to acknowledge or repair the damage afterward. The avoidant either doesn't understand what they did wrong, minimizes the impact, gets defensive, or simply refuses to discuss it. This secondary wound, the repair that never comes, often hurts worse than the original withdrawal because it confirms your fear that you don't matter enough for them to do the uncomfortable work of understanding your pain. But their inability to repair comes from the exact same attachment system that caused them to withdraw. Just as they couldn't stay present during flooding, they can't engage in vulnerable repair conversations that would require them to sit with guilt, shame, and the reality of their impact on you. Understanding this pattern means you stop interpreting their failed repairs as evidence that you don't matter, and start seeing them as evidence of how deeply their avoidant wiring runs. An avoidant who could engage in genuine repair after hurting you probably wouldn't have hurt you in that particular way to begin with. The withdrawal and the inability to repair are two manifestations of the same core wound: the terror of emotional vulnerability and the nervous system that treats intimate connection as danger. This understanding doesn't make their inability to repair okay, and it doesn't mean you should tolerate it in ongoing relationships. But it does allow you to forgive them for something they genuinely cannot do, rather than continuing to rage at them for withholding something you believe they could provide if they just cared enough. After you've validated your pain, separated their capacity from their character, released the debt, grieved the fantasy, and understood their systemic inability to repair, you can begin to hold their suffering with compassion without making it your responsibility to fix or accommodate. You can acknowledge that living in an avoidant nervous system is its own prison, that their inability to receive love without terror is a tragedy for them, that their pattern of pushing away the connection they desperately want is painful. You can feel sadness for their pain without making it an excuse for their impact on you. This compassionate witnessing completes the forgiveness cycle because it allows you to see them as a whole, wounded human, rather than as the villain in your story or the savior in your fantasy. Compassionate witnessing from a distance maintains healthy boundaries while opening your heart. You're not moving back toward them, not trying to fix them, not making yourself available for another round of their deactivation cycle. You're simply acknowledging from your new, separate position that they're struggling with something real and painful, and you can hold that truth without it changing your decision to protect yourself from future hurt. Many people think forgiveness means reconciliation, means opening the door again, means giving them another chance. It doesn't. Forgiveness means you've released the emotional charge of the hurt. You're no longer controlled by resentment, and you can think about them without your nervous system lighting up with rage or pain. It doesn't mean you trust them, doesn't mean you forget what happened, doesn't mean the relationship returns to what it was. Some shifts make forgiveness sustainable rather than temporary. You have to forgive yourself for whatever role you played in the dynamic, for staying too long, for ignoring red flags, for trying to fix them, for making their comfort more important than your needs, for losing yourself in the process of trying to earn their consistent presence. Self-forgiveness is actually harder than forgiving the avoidant, because you hold yourself to a standard of, "I should have known better," that you don't apply to them. But you were doing your best with the attachment wiring, the information, and the hopes you had at that time. You can look back with more wisdom now and see what you'd do differently. And you can also extend compassion to the version of yourself who was in the middle of it, trying to make it work, believing love would be enough. You have to release the need for the forgiveness to be witnessed or validated by them. The deepest forgiveness happens entirely within you, requiring nothing from them. Not acknowledgement of your process, not gratitude for your grace, not even awareness that you've done this work. If your forgiveness is contingent on them knowing you forgave them, you're still entangled, still needing something from them, still handing them power over your peace. True forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not a performance for their benefit. They may never know you went through this protocol, may never understand the work it took, may never appreciate that you released them from debts they didn't even know they owed. That irrelevance is actually the marker of complete forgiveness, when their awareness or response doesn't factor into your healing at all. Understand that forgiveness isn't a single event, but a practice you'll return to multiple times. You'll think you've forgiven them completely, and then a song will come on, or you'll see a couple being affectionate in public, or you'll have a dream about them, and suddenly all the anger resurfaces. That doesn't mean you failed at forgiveness. It means you're human, and healing isn't linear. Each time the charge returns, you run through the protocol again, you validate the resurfaced pain, you separate capacity from character, you release the debt again, you grieve the fantasy again, You witness with compassion again. Over time, the returns become less frequent and less intense, until eventually you can think about them with neutral acceptance rather than emotional activation. Forgiveness also means accepting that you'll never have the full story of what happened inside them during their deactivation. You'll never know exactly what they were thinking, what they were feeling, why they made the specific choices they made. Your mind will continue generating theories and narratives, trying to construct a complete understanding that would make the hurt make sense. Part of forgiveness is accepting the permanent ambiguity, the gaps in the story that will never be filled, the questions that will never be answered. You forgive them without understanding everything, without having all the pieces, without the neat closure that would make the forgiveness feel justified. You forgive into the uncertainty, because staying stuck, waiting for complete understanding, is its own form of prison. What signals successful forgiveness isn't that you think about them with warmth or that you'd want them back in your life. It's that you think about them with acceptance and peace, that you can acknowledge both the good and the harm without your system activating, that you can hold the complexity of who they were without needing to make them all villain or all victim. You stop needing them to be worse than they were to justify your pain, and you stop needing them to be better than they were to justify your love. They were exactly who they were. Someone with a beautiful capacity for connection when regulated, and a devastating pattern of withdrawal when threatened. Someone who hurt you deeply without full awareness or intention. Someone whose limits collided with your needs in a way that created real damage. You forgive that whole, complex, flawed human for being unable to be the person you needed them to be. Forgiving an avoidant doesn't erase what happened, doesn't minimize the harm, doesn't require you to trust them again. It simply releases you from the exhausting work of holding them accountable for debts they can't pay, waiting for understanding they can't reach, and organizing your emotional life around their absence. Every minute you spend in unforgiveness, rehearsing old conversations, constructing explanations they'll never hear, waiting for acknowledgement they'll never provide, that's a minute you're giving to someone who isn't even in the room. Forgiveness returns those minutes to you. If you've been hurt by an avoidant, I'd love to hear about your forgiveness journey in the comments. What part of this protocol resonated most with your experience? If this video helped shift something for you, hit that like button and subscribe for more content on healing attachment wounds. Thanks for watching, and remember that forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not something you wait to receive permission to give. Thanks for watching.